Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a really delightful book I finished reading recently. This is called Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, The Plants and Places That Inspired the Classic Children's Tale, and it's written by Marta McDowell. So this came out in 2013. I got it as a Christmas gift this year, and right now I'm recording this in January. There's a blanket of snow outside here in Virginia, and in the depths of winter, that's when I always pick up gardening books, so it can kind of inspire me and carry me through the cold, dark days of winter as I look forward to spring, which is always just around the corner. So I'm looking forward to that. But this was a really wonderful thing to read as the days have been shorter and darker, both because I love gardening, and if you followed my channel, you'll know that to be the case. But I also really love Beatrix Potter. Again, I've got 4 going on 5 kids right now, and 3 girls who love Beatrix Potter, love reading the books, love the old films that they made back in the 80s. And so we have a lot of Beatrix Potter stuff in our house, and it was great to get a bit of her biography kind of through the lens of her gardening. And that's really what this book is. If you look at the table of contents, the way that McDowell has kind of structured her book is around, first off, just trying to get a sense of Beatrix Potter's life as a gardener. So she's walking through her biography, where she was born, her childhood, how her career unfolded, how she moved up to the Lake District, how she eventually got married, and then on to her death. And so it's a biography in its own right, but it has as its particular kind of interest the gardens that shaped Beatrix Potter and that she in turn would end up shaping. One thing that you will notice as you read Beatrix Potter's books, of course, is that she fills her books, she fills her paintings with scenes from nature, and they're very accurate scenes from nature. Sometimes people, when they're drawing flowers, just kind of draw a generic flower, and that's not what Beatrix Potter does. She writes, she both writes and paints with a very kind of Victorian eye toward the details of the flora around her, and that really shows that she had a strong interest in plants. She had a strong interest. One thing that came out in this book is she was interested in mycology, the study of fungi, and in fact at one point thought about trying to pursue mycology as kind of her calling or discipline. That didn't end up panning out, but you can see that she draws mushrooms and things in her stories, and they're accurate to specific plants and so forth. And so what McDowell wanted to do as a horticulturalist herself was to look at Beatrix Potter's life through the lens of plants, through the lens of gardens. And so what she does in the first part of her book, this is the first about 150 pages of the book, is to basically go through her life and pay attention to the gardens that she grew up in and around, and the way in which she blossomed and bloomed as a gardener herself. So the title chapters are Germination, Offshoots, Flowering, Roots, Ripening, and Setting Seed. So it's kind of casting her biography in these very botanical gardening terms. One of the things that is interesting about Beatrix Potter, she came from a fairly well-to-do family, grew up in London. They had garden across the street that was kind of only for residents of that neighborhood, and so she grew up being able to go there. But she had family, grandparents and parents who ended up both buying large estates, including one estate that had the landscaping designed by Capability Brown, who, if you know anything about gardening history, landscape design, he was a central figure in kind of reimagining what English gardens could and should look like. It had a big impact on the way that Beatrix Potter thought about garden design. It was a very sharp contrast from the very rigid neoclassical French fashion that was prominent in the 18th century. And so she grew up in these beautiful spaces, both public gardens and private gardens. And one of the things that her family loved to do as well was to go on holiday and to travel to Scotland especially, but to the Lake District and other places as well. And each of those homes that they kind of visited or traveled to had beautiful gardens, had in-house residential gardeners who were caring for those things and designing those things. And so Beatrix Potter just grew up around flowers and plants and scenes of nature. And even though she was from London originally, she was very much at heart a country girl, and that very much comes out in her interest. It talks about her her life and the way that things unfolded. She was always a bit awkward at different points in times. She was not the sort of society girl. She was very down to earth. She was very accessible. She was very funny. She was very intelligent, but not the kind of suave or sophisticated, charming society debutante that London aristocrats might have been looking for. So she found a kinship more in nature and the natural world, and often in the very down-to-earth people who cared for it, the gardeners and things that she worked with, and the postmen and things like that. And so this book kind of gives you Beatrix Potter's story, her biography, through the lens of those kinds of relationships and those kinds of interactions. One of the things I should mention about this book as well is that it is a beautiful book. It is well made, hardcover, I think Smithsonian binding, and it contains a lot of her own watercolors, as well as photographs of her from various points in her life. It has some interesting, there's Beatrix Potter as a young girl out by a garden gate. It's got some helpful maps to kind of orient you to where she lived. So she was born here in London, just a few blocks south of Kensington Gardens. So just beautiful space for horticultural and botanical pursuits. So this is the private garden that was across the street from the house where she was born, and the gardens there in Kensington. So you can see how it gives you a real window into what Beatrix Potter herself would have seen and would have experienced, and you can see through her eyes as well, because it contains a lot of sketches that she did, a lot of, later on, there will be many of her own, scans of letters that she wrote. So you can see her own handwriting and penmanship. You can see as well the watercolors that she painted, both scenes from her books and then kind of pointing out the horticultural or botanical elements. So you're seeing the prominence of the snowdrops here, or just stills that she did, because she was constantly paying attention to the world around her, paying attention to nature, and using that as an inspiration for her own artistic eye and endeavor. So here you have a picture of the house that she would buy in the Lake District, Hilltop, and then here you have a beautiful watercolor and pencil piece that she did in 1909, kind of taken from this part of the Lake District. So as you flip through this book, it makes it an easy and delightful read, because you've got lots of beautiful things to look at and great windows into Beatrix Potter's world. So that's the first part of the book, going through her life as a gardener. Then what Marta McDowell does is a very interesting section, about another 100 pages or so, where she walks through a year in Beatrix Potter's garden. So once Beatrix Potter had made her fortune from her children's books, she moved up to the Lake District. She was able to buy actually several properties. Hilltop Farm and Castle Cottage were kind of the two main ones. She ended up marrying a man who was a solicitor there, Mr. Heelis, so she became Mrs. Heelis, and they had a working farm. She wanted it to be profitable. They had an extensive garden, both for vegetables and for flowers and things, and she threw herself into the work there and really made those spaces her own. So again, she was not a kind of aristocratic country gardener who hired on help to do all the work for her. She would have helpers, of course, along the way, but she was herself a gardener, and she was self-taught. She kind of came into it a little bit later in life, and really enjoyed it right down to the end of her life. And so part 2 of the book, having kind of walked through her story through the lens of gardens, is to spend a year in her garden and to kind of go through what was going on in the winter, what was going on in the spring, the autumn, the summer, and what was, the things that she wrote about, or the things that she talked about, or the things she took pictures of, or the things that she painted. Because this is part of what shapes this book, is that Beatrix Potter is constantly in her journals, in her letters, in her books, talking about and mentioning different plants, different gardening projects, different experiences that she's had. And so we can actually reconstruct a lot about what her gardening life looked like and what her gardens themselves looked like. And that kind of leads into the third and final part of the book, which is called Visiting Beatrix Potter's Gardens. So several of her gardens and properties have been retained by the National Trust. Of course, Beatrix Potter was one of the movers and shakers to help promote the conservation of the Lake District, just an area of tremendous natural beauty. I was able to visit there once when I was living in England. I would happily spend a lot more time there. but it's a gorgeous area, and it was saved from being developed and overdeveloped in Beatrix Potter's day. And she was able to use a lot of her wealth and influence, both domestically, and she had a lot of friends in America who gave to the work of setting aside many of the landscapes and beautiful areas there in the Lake District to be a conservation for all generations. And she actually donated a lot of her property to make that happen. Several of her properties, including Hilltop Farm, have been retained by the National Trust, which is an organization in England that manages a lot of historic homes and gardens and properties. And what they do with that garden is to try to really replicate what Beatrix Potter herself had growing and going in her garden space. And you may wonder, well, how could they possibly know that? Well, it's because we have photographs, we've got sketches, we've got mentions in her letters and in her diary and in her correspondence and things of various types of what she was growing when and what was coming up and what she was trying to do. And so they've tried as much as they can to kind of replicate that, so that if you go to the Lake District today in the north of England and you visit Hilltop Farm, you'll get to step into something very close to what Beatrix Potter herself would have experienced. And so this book kind of gives you a taste of that. There's lots of great photos and things showing you what her gardens are like. And then part 3, again, is kind of surveying the different gardens that are still there, how you can visit them, where they are. It's also really cool because a lot of the places that are in Beatrix Potter's books are really taken from the scenes in her own garden or in the villages, in the village of Sowry there nearby. So if you, again, know the books, you'll see lots of familiar scenes and go, oh, okay, she wasn't making that up out of nowhere. She was actually putting real places into her wonderful stories. And then the very last part of the book is actually a really cool collection. This is kind of nerdy, but it's a really cool collection of Beatrix Potter's plants. So she's Marta McDowell has made a running list of all the plants that Beatrix Potter mentions in her books or her correspondence. So anywhere in her writings that we have mention of a plant, you have here the common name, which Beatrix Potter often used. Even though she was conversant in Latin, she preferred the common name. So it'll give you the common name, it'll give you the botanical name in Latin, it'll give you, the general type of plant. Is it a perennial? Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? Is it an annual? Is it a shrub or a tree or whatever? And then the primary source, where you can actually find this plant mentioned. It's pretty amazing, really, to think that somebody has taken the time to go through and put that together. And then that has been done for her books as well. So you can actually go through, like The Tale of Peter Rabbit, and see all of the plants that are either mentioned explicitly in the text, that's marked in this column, or shown in the art, that's marked in this column. So if you're learning about plants, and this would be a great way to kind of test your knowledge and expand things, pick up, The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, or The Tale of Gloucester, or The Tale of Benjamin Bunny, one of these Beatrix Potter classics, and then see how many you can identify, and then go back and you can sort of see, how many you recognize. So again, really fascinating book. A lot of research went into this. You can tell it's very much a labor of love. And I think it's a book that would be greatly enjoyed by anyone who loves gardening or loves Beatrix Potter, or ideally loves both. And so often the love of both of those things do go together. If I had a critique of the book, this is a very minor thing, but it would just be one little critique, or really just sort of thing that could be done to improve it. And that is, I would love to have in the front of the book or in the back of the book, somewhere easily accessible, a more detailed map of Beatrix Potter's garden. I didn't bring it up with me, but if you look at my review that I did of Monty Don's book, The Complete Gardener, in the very front of that book, he has a beautifully done, kind of sketched out drawing map of his gardens, how they're laid out, kind of generally what's planted where. It's not an exhaustive, plant schematic or anything, but it gives you a sense of what's going on where in the garden, which is very helpful when you're reading about that garden as you go through the book. And I often found as I was reading through this, especially parts 2 and 3, where you're spending a year in Beatrix Potter's garden and then talking about visiting the garden, it'd be great to have a more detailed map that kind of walks you through that. There is one kind of overhead map that they have of Hilltop Farm, but it's not quite as detailed as I think might be helpful. And secondly, it's kind of crammed into the middle of the book, so it's easy to kind of lose your place and not be able to find that. But if they ever come out with another edition, I think that would be a great addition to add to a new edition. But even without that, this is a great book and something that can be greatly loved by gardeners everywhere. So I'd highly recommend Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life by Marta McDowell.